Oregon, January 1881, a blizzard, a gallows. The rope was already tight around her neck, and the crowd below was laughing. Almost feel sorry for that rope. Maeve Hollister stared straight back at them. Bare feet on ice-glazed wood, blood beginning to seep through the cracks, but she did not look down. Then the world exploded. The scaffold collapsed. She had 1 second. 1 second to choose die here or run into the dark heart of the storm. She ran, and that's where this story really begins. Follow and hit the bell because you don't want to miss a single moment of where this goes. The wind hit Oakhaven like a fist. January 1881, and the blizzard had been chewing at Oregon's mountain towns for 3 days straight. The sky was white. The ground was white. Even the air seemed made of ice, sharp and thick and hostile, pressing down on everything in sight. The townspeople had gathered anyway, 40 of them, bundled in coats and scarves, stamping their boots against the frozen ground. They'd come out in a blizzard to watch a hanging. That alone said everything you needed to know about Oakhaven. Maeve Hollister stood on the wooden scaffold with a rope around her neck. She was 24 years old and trying very hard not to shake. Not only from fear, though fear was there too, cold and heavy in her stomach. She was shaking because her feet were bare on the planks, and the planks were glazed in ice, and she had nothing left to her name but a torn gray dress that the wind cut straight through. They'd taken her shoes. She didn't know why. Maybe to humiliate her one last time. Get on with it already. Someone hollered from the crowd. Laughter broke out. Then another voice, louder. Maeve kept her eyes fixed on a spot above the crowd, a pine tree at the far edge of the square, bent sideways by the wind. She stared at it hard. Pine trees could survive a blizzard. They bent and didn't break. She was trying to believe that meant something. Look at the size of her. The voice came from the front of the crowd, a red-cheeked man grinning, elbowing his neighbor. His neighbor grinned back. Almost feel sorry for that rope. More laughter, louder this time. Maeve breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. The air burned her lungs like swallowing glass. She had heard every version of this her whole life, in the schoolyard, at her father's shop, at church, of all places, muttered behind hymnals and Sunday gloves. She had built calluses over it, the same as you build calluses on your palms from hard labor. Thick enough that she'd convinced herself it couldn't reach her anymore. Standing here, she knew she'd been wrong about that. Citizens of Oakhaven, the voice that cut through the crowd, belonged to Judge Corvus Sterling. He stood at the base of the scaffold in a long black coat, hands clasped behind his back, looking entirely at peace with the world. The satisfied look of a man who knew he'd already won. He was 48, well-fed, and had never stood in a place like the one Maeve occupied. He never would, Justice, Sterling announced, pivoting slightly toward the crowd, with the practiced ease of a man who enjoyed being watched, does not wait for spring. A few people nodded. One man started clapping and stopped when nobody joined him. Sterling let the moment breathe, then lifted his gaze to Maeve. He didn't sneer. Exactly. He didn't need to. His eyes were enough amused, contemptuous, utterly unbothered. She was a problem he was wrapping up today. A loose end in the shape of a woman. Maeve Hollister, he said calmly, convicted of the murder of Deputy Morris Crane, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul. She hadn't killed Morris Crane. She hadn't killed anyone. But Sterling had the bench, the jury, and the sheriff tucked in his pocket, so the truth hadn't mattered much at trial. What had mattered was the silver. Her family's land sat over one of the richest silver veins in the territory. She hadn't known. Her parents hadn't known. But Sterling had known for years. Now, with her parents gone and a false conviction nailed to her name, the land would pass to the county, and the county would pass to him. That was the plan. She'd been on this scaffold for 4 minutes. The executioner behind her, a thick man named Greer, who smelled of tobacco and stale beer, was adjusting something on the rope. The hood they'd tried to put over her head had blown away in the gale, which meant she could see every face in the crowd. Some looked away when she found their eyes. Most didn't. Sterling's small, steady smile never moved. At the far edge of the square, Near a supply wagon parked against the trading post, a man in a dark brown coat was loading packages into a saddlebag with quiet, deliberate focus. Tall, young-looking. He'd been there when they marched her out, and he was still there now. She'd noticed him because he wasn't laughing. He wasn't watching the scaffold with that particular gleam. Everyone else had. His jaw was set. He glanced toward her, then toward the wagon, then back again. His hand disappeared inside the saddlebag and went still. Greer's palm dropped onto Maeve's shoulder. Heavy. "Final time," he said. Sterling's voice rose below, beginning some formal closing phrase. The crowd went quieter. The wind dropped for just a second, that strange held-breath pause that sometimes arrives in the middle of a storm, as if the world itself is waiting. The explosion shattered it like an axe through dry wood. The supply wagon blew apart in a column of orange and white. Someone had put a bullet directly into the ammunition crate bolted to the wagon's side, and now the whole east end of the square was fire and noise and flying timber. The crowd broke instantly, screaming, running, slamming into each other in every direction. The scaffold shuddered. The post nearest the steps gave way. The wood was old and half-rotten, and the shock wave was more than it could take. The whole structure tilted hard left, and Greer stumbled sideways, throwing both arms out to catch himself. His grip on everything else vanished completely. That was all Maeve needed. She drove her heel back into Greer's knee with everything she had. He went down with a grunt. The noose had gone slack with the tilt of the platform. She grabbed the loop with both bound hands and shoved it upward, over her chin, over her nose. Off, she didn't stop to look at anything. She just ran, off the edge of the platform, down into the snow. Her bare feet hit the frozen ground and the cold shot straight through her like electricity. She ran. The blizzard swallowed her within seconds. Behind her, she could still hear shouting, the roar of the fire, and then Sterling's voice, high and sharp, and nothing like his courtroom composure, screaming her name into the storm. She ran harder. Snow was deep past the square, knee-high in the drifts between the buildings, and every step was a battle. Her feet had gone past cold, and into something beyond cold numb. First, then burning, then a terrible nothing. She couldn't feel the ground anymore. She just kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and she had not survived a hanging to die face down in a snowdrift 3 streets from the square. She didn't know who'd set off that explosion, didn't know why. A stranger with a frown and a quick hand, that was all she had. It was enough. Oakhaven disappeared behind the white wall of the storm. Pine trees closed in around her on both sides. Her legs were slowing, her breath tearing through her in ragged gasps that frosted the air in front of her face. She couldn't feel her feet at all now. The cold had moved into her chest, her hands, the space behind her eyes. She ran until she couldn't run anymore. Then she walked. Then, without deciding to, she fell. The snow caught her without ceremony. She lay face down, chest heaving, listening to her own heartbeat loud in her skull. Her feet were bleeding, she could tell from the dark red, spreading faint and slow through the white beneath her. The cold was everywhere now, inside her, through her, past her skin entirely. She thought about her parents, about the land they'd worked with their hands, about the look on Sterling's face right before the world blew apart. She pressed her palms flat into the snow. She pushed herself up, still alive, bleeding and frozen and alone in a blizzard in the Oregon mountains, bare feet, leaving red prints on white ground, but alive. A body that had just survived what no one in that crowd believed it could. Maeve Hollister kept walking. The light appeared like something she'd imagined. A yellow glow through the trees, steady and warm against the dark and the driving snow. She almost didn't trust it. Her mind had been doing strange things for the past mile, folding in on itself from cold and exhaustion, playing tricks. But the light stayed put as she stumbled toward it. Then she could smell smoke. Then she could make out the outline of a cabin pressed against the base of a ridge. Then she was on the porch steps. She got both hands on the railing. That was as far as she got. Her legs stopped. Not slowly, not with warning. They simply quit, and she went down hard on the wooden planks. And the cold rushed up to meet her from the boards. Inside the cabin, something moved. Gideon Cross had been sitting up because the storm was the kind that got into the joints and made sleep difficult. He was on his second cup of cold coffee, carving nothing in particular from a block of pine, when the sound came through from the porch. He was on his feet before he'd thought about it. Years working the timber yards had made his body fast that way, respond first and later. He threw open the door and nearly stepped on her. A woman, curled on her side on the porch boards, shaking so hard he could hear her teeth. She wore the thinnest gray dress he'd ever seen on a living person in January, and her feet were bare, bleeding, dark red against the white dusting of snow, coating the boards. Jasper. His voice cut clean across the cabin now. He crouched and gathered her up. She weighed exactly as much as a person her size should weigh, and Gideon carried her the way you carry something that matters carefully. Close to his chest, moving fast but steady, he kicked the door shut behind him with his boot heel. Jasper Thorne appeared from the back room, already pulling his shirt on, took one look at what Gideon was holding, and went directly to the supply chest. He had his medical bag open in under 30 seconds. 4 years as a field surgeon had trained that reflex into him so deep it would never leave. Gideon settled her down on the rag rug in front of the hearth. She was trying to open her eyes, trying to speak. Her lips had gone bluish at the corners. "Don't talk," Jasper said. His voice was even and calm. "Just breathe. She started. "Breathing," he said. "That's your only job right now." He moved fast, checking her pulse at the wrist and throat, tilting her head back, assessing her eyes. Gideon was already working on the fire. 3 logs, iron poker, flames kicking up orange and gold, and throwing heat into the room. Her core temperature is critically low. Jasper was already reaching into his bag. "We need to get her out of these clothes." The gray dress was soaked straight through to the skin. Ice had crystallized along the hemline and the sleeves. Leaving it on her was the same as keeping her packed in cold. He reached for his medical scissors, long-bladed, steady in his hand. The woman's eyes opened wide. No, she shrank back, one arm pressing flat against herself. "Please, don't." "I'm a physician," Jasper said gently. "Former field surgeon. I need to see what I'm working with, and these clothes are working against you right now." He kept his voice level and unhurried. "I have treated more human beings in more conditions than most men see in 3 lifetimes. What I am interested in right now is making sure you're alive tomorrow. Nothing else." She looked at him. Then she looked at Gideon, who had deliberately turned his back and was focused entirely on the fire. Stoked the coals with the same quiet, steady attention he gave everything. He did not glance over, did not comment. Her hand dropped. Jasper worked quickly and without ceremony. The scissors moved through the wet cloth in clean lines. He peeled the fabric back, and immediately Maeve's arms crossed her midsection. Her shoulders curled inward. Her whole body tried to fold itself smaller than it was, tried to retreat somewhere it couldn't go. Jasper stopped. "Don't!" he said, not sharply, not with impatience. He said it the way you'd say careful to someone about to step on a loose board, direct, present, like it mattered. She looked up at him. He held her eyes and kept his voice quiet. "Your body just survived a trek that would have killed the leanest men in this territory. Matter of fact, like stating the temperature. In medicine and under God, a body that fights this fiercely to live is a masterpiece. Don't you ever apologize for existing?" Maeve stared at him. She searched his face for the catch, for the smirk underneath it, the mocking edge she'd learned to brace for before the real words arrived. The punchline version of the thing. She had been looking for that catch for 24 years, and she was very good at spotting it. It wasn't there. He was already back to work. Gideon moved in from the other side, unfolding 2 thick wool blankets from the chest, positioning them to wrap around her as Jasper proceeded, still not looking at her face. Just doing what needed doing, keeping her warm, taking care of things. It was the most matter-of-fact act of human decency she had ever been shown, and she didn't know what to do with it. The blankets went around her, thick and smelling of cedar and wood smoke. Jasper checked her feet. His expression changed slightly when he saw them, a professional tightening around the eyes. Frostbite on the toes, bad enough to take seriously. Her wrists were raw from rope burns, skin cracked and weeping at the creases, cuts on the soles of her feet from the frozen ground. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked. A half-second pause. Maeve. He nodded once. "I'm Jasper. The man who's been having a deeply personal conversation with the fireplace is my brother Gideon." Gideon half-turned and gave her a single nod. Hard jaw, dark stubble, not unkind, reserved. A man who thought before he spent words. "You're safe here," he said. 2 words, said simply. She turned them over and didn't quite know what to do with them either. Jasper heated water and began cleaning the cuts on her feet with patient, deliberate hands. Even through the numbness, the pain sang clearly, and Maeve gripped the blanket and focused on breathing. He applied salve from a tin in his bag, wrapped each foot in clean cloth strips, with the practiced movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, and moved without wasted motion. She watched him and tried to understand who these men were. No woman in the cabin, from what she could see. Tools hung neat on the wall, wood shavings swept to one corner, a shelf of books, medical texts, a couple of novels, a Bible with a cracked spine that had been actually read. This wasn't a rough bachelor's shack. Someone had built this life with intention. "Drink this." Gideon held out a tin cup. He'd heated broth on the iron stove. He offered it at an angle that let her take it herself. Didn't push it toward her, didn't hover over her shoulder. Just held it out and stepped back. The broth went down like something sacred. Salt and warmth and dried herbs and heat spreading outward from the center of her. She drank slowly with both hands around the cup. Her eyes filled without warning. She blinked hard. Looked at the fire. She was alive. Somehow, incredibly, she was still alive. "Sleep now," Jasper said. He helped her settle onto the wide rope bed closest to the hearth, pulling the blankets up without fuss. "Your body needs rest above everything else tonight." Questions in the morning. He didn't ask who she was. Didn't ask why her wrists bore rope marks, why her feet were bare, why she'd come staggering out of the middle of a January blizzard alone. He simply let her be a person in need of help, because that was the only thing that mattered to him right now. She was asleep before she finished trying to say thank you. Gideon and Jasper sat across from each other at the rough table after the fire was banked, and Maeve's breathing had slowed to deep, and even in the corner. "Rope burns on her wrists," Gideon said. "I noticed." Her neck, too. Jasper was quiet for a moment. "Faint ligature mark." "Yes." A log settled in the hearth. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls. "She's not going anywhere in this weather," Gideon said. "No," Jasper agreed. "She's not." Neither man said anything further. There wasn't much else to say. She woke to gray daylight and the smell of coffee and pine resin, and for one disoriented second, she didn't know where she was. Then her feet told her, sharp, singing pain through the bandaging. She lay still and listened. From somewhere outside came the rhythmic bite of an axe on wood. Inside the cabin, nothing moving. She was alone. The first thing she did was check the bed frame. She pressed her palms slowly into the mattress, testing the boards. The frame held without a sound, but she stayed careful anyway, easing herself upright inch by inch, distributing her weight, waiting for the groan of wood that she had learned over years and years of humiliating experience to expect. Chairs, pew benches, the wooden step at her father's shop, things threatening to give, and the faces that came with that sound. The frame held. She let out a breath. She was dressed in a loose flannel shirt that fell past her hips, and men's trousers cinched at the waist with a rope. Someone had seen to that while she was barely conscious. She had a fever-blurred memory of Jasper's even voice and efficient hands. The cloth was clean, worn soft. She looked around the cabin properly for the first time. Small, but solid, well-built. A single room with a kitchen end and a sleeping end, divided by the central hearth. Thick-paned windows, frost on the outside, clear within. A work table along the far wall covered in tools and half-shaped pieces of wood. The books on the shelf, an iron pot hanging above the low embers. On the table, a cloth-covered plate and a tin cup, and leaning against the cup, a folded piece of paper. She read it from across the room first. "Broth on the fire. Eat when ready. Don't let your feet touch the cold floor. Wool socks on the chair beside you." She looked down. Gray wool socks, thick, mended at one heel, sitting on the chair, exactly as stated. She pulled them on carefully over the bandages, then stood, tested her weight slowly, and crossed to the table. She lifted the cloth, cornbread, and a small portion of cured meat. She ate 2 bites. Then she set the fork down and sat looking at the rest of it. 2 men in a cabin. In January, blizzard outside, days from town, a third person appearing out of nowhere and needing to be fed. She was eating into a supply that hadn't accounted for her. She covered the plate back up. The door opened. Jasper came in, stamping snow from his boots, a length of firewood under one arm, his breath fogging in the cold air. He spotted the covered plate in the first 3 seconds. "You didn't eat," he said. "I wasn't very hungry." He hung his coat on the peg, unhurried. "You're running on frostbite and adrenaline from yesterday. Your body heals by burning fuel. That isn't a suggestion, it's just biology. I didn't want to use too much." He stopped and looked at her. "Too much of what?" She didn't answer. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, forearms on the table, in no particular hurry. "Maeve, we have half a deer hanging in the cold room, 2 sacks of dried beans, cornmeal enough for 2 weeks, and a root cellar that Gideon stocked in November like he was preparing for a siege. He takes winter provisioning very seriously." A pause. "You, eating that plate is not going to leave us short, so eat." She looked at him for a moment. "There's no version of this," he said, "where you apologize for needing to eat." She reached over and pulled the cloth off the plate. Jasper went back to moving around the cabin, restacking wood near the hearth, checking the water bucket, flipping through a page in his medical journal. He didn't watch her eat. He simply existed in the space without making her feel examined, which was a consideration she hadn't often received. Gideon came in an hour later with a cold wind at his heels. She registered his size more clearly in daylight, several inches past 6 feet. Built from years of real labor, not display. He pulled off his hat, shook it, looked at the empty plate, and gave one small nod. He didn't smile. He didn't make a comment. He just registered it and moved on. Somehow that landed better than if he'd said something. Mid-morning, Jasper sat her on the edge of the bed and rewrapped her feet. He was meticulous about it, pressing lightly at specific points to test sensation, checking the color around the toes, explaining his work without being asked. "Frostbite heals with warmth and time," he said. "The tissue responds well when it's kept dry and bandaged properly. You were lucky with the timing." He said it clinically, professionally, and what she heard underneath it was, "You are worth treating with precision." She watched his hands and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that a stranger was this careful. The problem of the chair happened around midday. Jasper had gone to the back room. Gideon was at the work table, steady and quiet with his chisel. Maeve needed to sit, her feet were aching, and the only seat near the warmth was one of the ladder-back chairs by the hearth. It looked solid, probably was solid, but she stood in front of it longer than she should have, running the old calculation, estimating, preparing for the possibility, the way she always prepared. Gideon glanced up from his work and saw her standing. He didn't say anything. He watched her for a moment, just a moment, then set his chisel down, stood, and walked to the back room. She heard rummaging, then the sound of tools starting up, the clean, purposeful rhythm of wood being worked. He came out, carrying a chair. Not one of the ladder-backs, something different, wider in the seat, with double-pegged crossbars where a standard chair had one. Thicker legs, heavier stock at the joints. It was built the way you'd build something, meant to last, meant to hold without question, meant to make a person feel steady. He set it down in front of the hearth. He didn't look at her with significance. He didn't wait for her reaction. He carried the old chair back to the table, sat down, and picked up his chisel again. Maeve looked at the chair for a long moment. She sat down. The wood didn't shift, didn't groan, didn't offer the slightest protest. Solid and quiet, and built exactly for this. Something eased in her chest. Something she hadn't known was clenched until it wasn't anymore. Later that afternoon, she heard him working in the back room again. Longer this time. The sound of him reinforcing something, methodical and patient. She understood after a while that it was the bed frame. He spent close to an hour on it. Never mentioned it when he came back out. Just washed his hands in the basin and went back to his carving. She didn't mention it either. By evening, the storm had dropped to a low hiss against the windows. Maeve sat in the new chair by the fire, both hands around a tin cup of coffee. Jasper read at the table. Gideon carved something small and worked with a quiet focus. Nobody pushed her to speak. Nobody watched her. Nobody filled the silence with noise just to fill it. She had been waiting all day for the other shoe, for the tired look that meant she was too much trouble, for the comment that had a second meaning, for the patience to run out the way it always ran out. It didn't come. The fire burned low and warm. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee and pine shavings. Outside, the blizzard rested and the mountain was quiet. Maeve did not move closer to the warmth than she already was. She still kept that careful margin, that little distance she'd learned to keep. Old habits, built over a lifetime, don't dissolve in a single day. But the chair held beneath her. Her feet were wrapped in healing. She had eaten. She had been warm. She had been left entirely and without condition to simply exist. For one evening, that was more than enough. The knock came at 2 in the morning. 3 knocks, fast and close together, and then silence. The particular cadence of someone who knew that pounding would be worse than announcing. Gideon was already on his feet before the second knock landed. He slept light and had since he was 19. From years of working camps, where light sleeping was the difference between your possessions staying yours and not. He had his rifle up and his body beside the doorframe, not in front of it when he called out. "Who is it?" Not a question. A demand. A pause from outside. Then Silas Cobb. "I'm alone. My horse is tied at the tree line, and I came the rest on foot so no one would see the tracks lead up." Another pause. "I know who you've got in there. That's why I came." Gideon and Jasper exchanged a look across the dark cabin. Behind them, Maeve was upright in the bed, both hands braced against the mattress, alert. Gideon cracked the door 2 inches, with his rifle barrel leading. The man outside held both hands out from his body, palms open. He wore a sheriff's badge on his coat, Oakhaven, copper dull and familiar. His face was somewhere in its 50s, lined deep from weather or worry or both. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept in at least a day. "I'm not here to take her," he said. "I swear that on my wife's grave." Gideon studied him for a long 3 seconds. Then he opened the door. Sheriff Silas Cobb came in and stood with his hat in his hands and didn't wait for an invitation to speak. He didn't have the luxury of manners right now, and he seemed to know it. "Sterling hired Hank Dugan," he said. Jasper stopped moving. He'd been reaching for the lamp wick and he just stopped. "Dugan," Gideon's voice was flat, out of Portland, came in on the night stage before the worst of the storm hit. Silas turned the hat brim through his fingers, around and around. "A nervous habit. He's the one Sterling calls when he needs something done fast and quiet. No conscience to speak of. Operates on money alone, which at least makes him predictable." Maeve sat at the edge of the bed and listened. She'd heard the name Hank Dugan once before, from her father, years ago. Her father had said it the way careful men say the names of things that can kill you, briefly, and only when necessary. "Sterling needs her gone before the federal circuit judge arrives at month's end," Silas continued. "Once a federal judge gets wind of the land claim discrepancies, the whole scheme starts unraveling. Sterling can't let that happen." He finally looked directly at Maeve. "It's the silver, miss, under your family's claim. Sterling had it surveyed 2 years ago. Private assayer out of Salem. Rich enough to make a man do bad things." "He already did bad things," Maeve said. "Yes." Silas looked at his hat. "He did, and I stood by and let him do most of them, and I have to live with that." He said it plainly. No performance in it. Just a man putting the thing on the table. "I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I came because Dugan is already tracking and he is very good at it, and someone needed to warn you." The fire had burned down to coals. Jasper put 2 more logs on without being asked, and the room brightened slowly. In the new light, Silas looked worse than he'd sounded, pale under the weathering. Hands that weren't quite steady. Jasper crossed to the shelf, poured a cup of coffee from the pot, and held it out. Silas took it, nodded once, drank. "How far out is Dugan?" Gideon asked. "Hard to say in this weather. He's tracking the blizzard pattern, working backward from where she went into the storm. He'll figure the mountain eventually. Might take him a day, Might take him 3. Silas set the empty cup on the table. But he'll figure it. Silas gave them what else he had: the direction Dugan had been seen heading, the description of the horse, the detail that Dugan worked alone and preferred it. Then he put his hat back on and moved toward the door. "I know this doesn't square things," he said to Maeve at the threshold. "Not by a long stretch." She looked at him. "No, it doesn't." He nodded like he'd expected exactly that, and went back out into the cold. Gideon latched the door behind him. The 3 of them stayed where they were for a moment, the new information settling into the room like a change in air pressure. Maeve stood up. "I should leave." Both men looked at her. "Tonight, before first light. If Dugan's tracking me, then staying here puts you both at risk." She said it steadily, without drama. She'd already run the logic. "You've done more for me than any 2 strangers ever had cause to. I won't repay that by leading a professional hunter to your door." Jasper opened his mouth. Gideon moved first. He crossed the cabin in 4 steps and stood in front of her, and gently, firmly, he took her hand. His was large, rough-palmed, warm. He didn't squeeze. He just held on. "You are not a burden, Maeve." His voice was low and absolutely certain. "Here, you are a human being and you are family." She stared at him. Family. The word dropped into the silence and rang there, clear and strange. She had not been someone's family since the autumn her parents died within 6 weeks of each other. That was 14 months ago, and it had been the longest 14 months of her life. Her throat moved. Gideon didn't release her hand. He held it a moment longer, and then let go, stepping back, giving her space to breathe. But his eyes stayed on her face, and what was in them was uncomplicated. He meant it. That was all. Jasper leaned against the table behind him. "Your feet aren't healed enough for mountain travel. You'd lose them to frostbite before morning." A pause. "Besides that, Gideon is right. We don't send family into a blizzard." Maeve looked between the 2 of them. She had her arguments ready, the reasonable ones, the selfless ones, the ones that came from a lifetime of trying to make herself smaller so she'd be easier to accommodate. She had all of them lined up. None of them came out. "All right," she said finally, quietly. Gideon went back to the work table and began sharpening his knife with calm, methodical strokes. Planning, Maeve understood, looked like this on him. Not pacing or talking, just getting his hands ready. Jasper moved to his medical bag and began quietly restocking. Gauze, carbolic solution, needle and catgut. He did it without comment. But the message was clear enough. He was preparing for whatever came next, and whatever came next was something he intended to be ready for. Maeve sat in the wide chair Gideon had built for her and watched the fire for a long time. She thought about the silver vein she'd never known existed, about her parents working that land for 30 years, raising her on it, building a life above a fortune they'd never even suspected, about Sterling sitting in his courthouse, knowing exactly what sat beneath the Hollister claim, smiling that flat smile, waiting for the right moment. She thought about her family's land. She thought about what it would mean to get it back. The fire held, the cabin held. Outside, the storm pressed on, and somewhere out there in the dark, a man named Dugan was working his way closer. But tonight, there was warmth, and coffee, and 2 men she had not earned, and could not explain, and was no longer willing to run from. Trust, once planted in the right soil, grows fast. She could feel it happening, and she didn't pull back. She let it grow. 3 days passed without incident. Gideon set extra tripwires along the 2 approach paths to the cabin. Jasper moved the rifle closer to the door. They kept the fire lower than usual, so the smoke column above the chimney would be thin, harder to spot from the ridge. Small adjustments, done without discussion because the 2 men had the kind of long familiarity that made discussion optional. They each just knew. Maeve watched and learned, and helped where she could. She was steady on her feet, now still tender, not ready for real distance, but functional. She mended a torn blanket at the table. She fed the fire in the night when the men slept. She cleaned and dried their tools without being asked. Small contributions, but she needed to make them. Sitting still while others worked on her behalf was not something she could do comfortably for long. On the 4th morning, Gideon rose before dawn to check the winter trap line. He did this twice a week, regardless of weather. It was income, and it was routine, and he was not a man who let either slide because things were complicated. "I'll be back before noon," he said. "Take the long route back," Jasper said from across the room, already at the stove. Gideon put his hat on. "I always do." He went out into the gray morning, and the door closed behind him, and the cabin became smaller and quieter in his absence, the way spaces do when the largest presence in them steps out. Jasper kept busy with his journals. Maeve sat at the table, and he talked her through some basic wound care technique, not because she needed it right this moment, but because he had a need to pass knowledge on. He'd always been that way. 4 years of watching men die from preventable infections had turned him into someone who taught constantly, reflexively, because information shared was suffering prevented. Carbolic acid on any cut, no matter how small, he was saying. People think infection needs a big wound to take hold. It doesn't. I lost a lieutenant to a blister on his heel. "That seems unfair," Maeve said. "Most of what infection does is unfair." He turned a page. "Fairness has nothing to do with biology. That's what makes it important to know." The wind outside had been building since mid-morning. By 11, it was a full howl, scouring the ridge and driving hard against the north-facing wall of the cabin. Snow ticked against the window pane in waves. Maeve was the one who heard it first. A footstep on the porch. One, then a pause. Her head came up. Jasper heard her go still and looked over. He closed the journal. His eyes went to the rifle, standing against the wall near the door. The door came off the frame. Not knocked open, torn off. The latch breaking under a single hard shoulder, the door swinging and cracking against the wall. The cold burst in, and with it came Hank Dugan. He was not a large man. Medium height, lean through the shoulders, wearing a duster that had seen 15 years of hard use. His face was angular and expressionless and focused in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with calculation. He had 2 revolvers at his hips and one already in his hand. "Don't," he said. Jasper was 3 feet from the rifle. He went for it anyway. The shot was fast and exact. It caught Jasper in the upper left shoulder, spinning him back into the wall and down. He hit the floor on one knee, one hand braced against the boards, his other arm hanging wrong. The breath went out of him in a hard grunt. Maeve came out of the chair. "Stop." Dugan's revolver swung to cover her. Then it swung to Jasper on the floor, then back to her. "I only need one of you alive. Keep that in mind." She stopped. Dugan assessed the room in 3 seconds. 1 woman, 1 man down, no other threats. He moved to Jasper with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this before. He pressed the barrel of the revolver against the side of Jasper's head, right at the temple, and Jasper went still under the pressure of it. Dugan looked at Maeve. "Sterling wants you in Oakhaven before the week's out. You come with me now. He lives." He said it with the same tone a man uses to quote a price at a market. "No heat, no satisfaction, pure transaction. You make this complicated, I don't need a witness. A beat. Your call." Jasper had one hand pressed to his shoulder, and blood was already coming through his fingers, darkening the cloth of his shirt, spreading. He was conscious, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were on Maeve, and she could see him trying to tell her something with his face. Trying to say, "Don't," without words, without moving, without giving Dugan any reason to pull that trigger. She heard it. She ignored it. She picked up the rifle from where it had fallen near the wall, and she held it for exactly 1 second. 1 second of considering, calculating, measuring the distance and the angle and the likelihood. Dugan pressed the barrel harder against Jasper's temple. She set the rifle down on the floor. "All right," she said. "Steady. Clear." She stepped away from the rifle. "I'll come." She was not surrendering. That distinction mattered to her, and she held it. She was making a choice, a deliberate, considered choice to prioritize Jasper's life over her own immediate safety. Those were different things, and she knew they were different. Weakness flinches and falls. She had chosen this with open eyes. Dugan moved with brisk efficiency. He took 2 sets of iron shackles from his coat and had her wrists bound in under a minute. Heavy iron, old and cold, clicking locked with a key he tucked back into his vest pocket. He pulled her coat from the peg by the door and tossed it at her. "Put that on." She did. She kept her eyes on Jasper. He was still on the floor, holding his shoulder, pale but upright. "Alive, there's a man in this cabin who needs medical attention," she said to Dugan as he moved her toward the door. "Then he'd better be quick about it," Dugan said. She grabbed her wool scarf from the peg as he pushed her forward. In the doorway, she turned back. Just for a second, Jasper met her eyes. She let the scarf fall into the red-stained snow on the threshold, where Gideon would see it. Then the storm took her. Dugan had a horse and a covered wagon waiting below the ridge, out of the wind. He moved fast, pushing her ahead of him, and she went without fighting. Not yet. She needed to know the terrain. She needed to know his patterns. She filed away everything she could, while her hands sat heavy in the iron. Back at the cabin, Jasper dragged himself to the supply chest, one hand shoulder screaming, blood soaking down his arm. He got the medical bag open on the second attempt and began working on himself with grim, shaking efficiency, talking himself through each step out loud in a voice low and level. Outside, the storm pulled the wagon and its passengers into white. Gideon came over the ridge at noon with 2 rabbits and a canvas sack of frozen winter traps, and stopped when he saw the door, broken off the frame. Standing open, he dropped the sack. Inside, the cabin torn through, furniture overturned, Jasper on the floor with his shoulder bound tight in improvised dressing, conscious, looking up at him with an expression that carried everything, without saying a word. Gideon took it all in one sweep. The broken door, the blood on the boards, the rifle on the floor, Jasper's shoulder, the empty cabin. He went to the threshold and looked out at the snow, following the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared into the white. And there, half buried already by the falling snow, a dark wool scarf, small and deliberate, left exactly where someone who knew him would look. He crouched and picked it up. He held it in both hands for a moment. Then he stood and turned back inside, and his face had changed. Whatever had been quiet and patient in it before was still there, but underneath it now was something else, something that didn't negotiate or wait. "How bad?" he said. "I'll live," Jasper said. He was already trying to get up. "Help me up!" Gideon crossed to him and got him to his feet in one steady motion, holding him until he found his balance. "The horses," Gideon said. "Yes," Jasper said. "The horses." Neither man wasted another second. The wagon moved slow through the drifts. Dugan drove from the front bench, back straight, eyes ahead. He did not speak to her, did not check on her. He had placed her in the covered bed of the wagon with her wrists shackled to an iron ring bolted to the center post, and then he had returned to driving as if the cargo behind him were a sack of grain. Professional detachment, complete and total. Maeve sat with that for about 10 minutes. Then she started paying attention. The wagon lurched and dragged every time the left rear wheel hit a deep drift. The resistance was distinct a pull, then a skip, then the whole frame shuddering. She'd grown up on working land. She understood wagons the way you understand anything you live alongside for years without thinking about it. That wheel was carrying weight unevenly. The hub or the spoke something in there was already compromised. She waited. The next time Dugan had to stand to manage the horse over a steep rise in the trail. The wagon tilted forward, and she used the momentum to shift her body hard left. The shackle ring pulled taut, but the bolt housing rocked slightly in its hole. Old hardware. The bolt had been seated into green wood that had since dried and shrunk around it. Good to know. She filed that away and looked at the wheel. It was close enough on her left side that she could reach it if she pressed her shoulder to the slats and extended her leg. The wheel cap, the iron disc that covered the axle end, was held by a single cotter pin. She could see it from here. Older wagons used a second pin as a backup. This one had only the one. Dugan was not going to stop moving because she asked him to, but he would stop if the wheel came off. She gave herself 20 minutes. Partly because that was how long it took to work the pin loose with the edge of her boot heel, while keeping her upper body still and her face neutral, and partly because she needed to put enough distance between herself and the cabin that Dugan wouldn't simply turn around and go back. She needed him frustrated and delayed, not redirected. The pin came loose on the 19th minute, and she tucked it between her palm and the iron cuff, where it would stay until she needed it gone. The wheel lasted another quarter-mile. She heard it go, a grinding metallic pop, then the sickening sideward lurch as the wheel cap released, and the wheel began to wobble on the naked axle. Dugan hauled the horse to a stop before the full collapse, experienced enough to feel it coming, but he was too late. The rear left corner of the wagon dropped hard and dug into the snow. He was off the bench and around to the back in seconds. She sat against the center post with her hands in her lap and her face composed. Dugan stared at the axle. Then he looked at her. She looked back. He had calculation behind his eyes, but no rage. He assessed her the way he'd assess a problem in the field, factoring in variables, adjusting his thinking. He glanced at the cotter pin housing, then at her leg position, then back. At the axle, he was smart. She'd counted on that. Smart men don't waste time with accusations they can't immediately prove, not when there's work to be done. "Get out," he said. She stood, shackle chain clinking, and he unlocked the ring from the post without releasing her wrists. He clipped a lead line to the chain between her cuffs instead. Then he went to work on the wheel. She stood in the snow and watched and memorized. The key to the shackles went into his left vest pocket, not his right. He favored his left hand for small tasks. He kept the second revolver on his right hip, with the strap snapped shut, which meant drawing it required an extra half-second. He had a hunting knife in his right boot, and he'd adjusted it twice without realizing, a tell that the sheath was slightly too loose. She collected every detail and said nothing. The repair took 40 minutes. Dugan worked efficiently and in silence, which she respected, even if she resented the circumstances. When the wheel was secured well enough to travel, he put her back in the wagon bed. This time, he checked the bolt housing on the ring and tightened it with his knife handle. She let him. She'd gotten what she needed from the delay. She'd bought time, stayed in her own head, and refused every second of self-pity that had tried to creep in from the edges. She was cold and shackled, and being transported to a man who wanted her dead. She was also observant, capable, and increasingly angry in the focused, useful way that made a person effective rather than frantic. Nobody was going to save her by arriving in time. That was the most useful thing she could accept right now. So she would save herself, and she would let the brothers help when they got there, and she would not waste a single minute between now and then feeling helpless. She watched the snowscape slide past through the gap in the wagon cover. She planned back at the cabin. The situation was more urgent. Gideon had gotten Jasper to the table and was working on the shoulder with both hands and the particular grim focus of a man who had learned field medicine at his brother's side over 15 years. Jasper was talking him through it, with controlled calm, a strange thing to witness. A man instructing someone else in repairing his own body, but it was necessary, and both of them knew it. "The ball went through," Jasper said, tightly. "Clean exit, top of the shoulder, missed the bone. Flush it with carbolic and pack it." "I know," Gideon said. "Packing tight. It will bleed worse if—" Jasper. Gideon looked up at him. "I know." A beat. Jasper exhaled through his nose and gripped the table edge and let Gideon work. The process took 20 minutes. Gideon's hands were precise and unhurried, which was a trained response rather than a natural one. He was not unhurried inside. But steady hands were a decision, and he made it. When the wound was flushed and packed and bound, with strips of boiled cloth, he tied the final knot and sat back. "Can you ride?" he said. Jasper tested his arm. His face tightened. "Yes, the truth." A pause. "I can ride." Gideon accepted that. He went to the corner and began loading the saddlebags without ceremony. Ammunition, medical kit, rope, hardtack. He moved with the same efficiency he brought to everything. Each item placed with the logic of a man thinking 3 steps ahead. Jasper dressed himself with one useful arm and considerable stubbornness, shrugged into his coat, and began going through his own bag. He packed the medical supplies methodically, and then reached to the back of the shelf and took down a wooden case about the length of a forearm. Gideon glanced at it. "Smoke compounds," Jasper said. He lifted the lid. Briefly, 8 glass vials nested in cloth padding, each sealed with wax, formulated for surgical tents when the field was overrun. calcium phosphide and sulfur compound. Burns white and thick for 30 seconds. He closed the lid. Incapacitates anyone breathing it in a confined space. Took me 2 years to get the ratios right. Non-lethal to healthy lungs. Temporarily. He tucked the case into his coat's interior pocket. I've never used them outside of a tent. You're about to. Yes. Jasper pulled his hat down. I am. Gideon was already outside saddling both horses by the time Jasper came through the door. The wind had dropped since morning, which was either luck or a brief intermission before the next bout. The trail Dugan's wagon had cut into the snow was visible heading south, already partially filled by drifting but readable. Gideon studied the tracks. They stopped about a mile down. See the displacement? Wheel trouble. She sabotaged the wheel, Jasper said. He stated it as fact, not question. Gideon allowed himself one small thing, a brief exhale that might have been the beginning of a smile, contained immediately. Probably. He mounted. Jasper got up on the second horse with effort and no complaint. They rode south into the white, and the mountain closed behind them, and neither man looked back. Sterling had it planned for midnight. No crowd this time. No audience. He didn't need witnesses, he needed the problem gone before Judge Harlan Bright arrived on the February stage. The hanging would be quiet, practical, and easily attributed to a prisoner lost during transit. Dugin would be paid, would leave, and would never speak of it. Men like Dugin never did. He'd had the temporary gallows set up in the alley behind the jail. One post, one beam, one rope, functional. The snow muffled everything in Oakhaven after 10 at night, which suited him perfectly. Dugan arrived at 9:30. Maeve came off the wagon with her wrists shackled and her back straight, and if the journey had broken anything in her, she had buried it somewhere Dugan couldn't see and Sterling couldn't use. Sterling met them at the jail door with his coat buttoned to the throat and his face arranged in that familiar expression above it all. Already bored by the conclusion. Any trouble? Sterling said. Wagon wheel, Dugan said. Delay? 40 minutes. Sterling's eyes moved to Maeve. He looked her over with the flat assessment of a man examining livestock. Well, here we are again, Miss Hollister. She said nothing. Put her in the cell until midnight, Sterling said. I'll have Morrison and Burke on watch. She was taken inside. She sat on the cell floor in the dark and went through everything she knew. The shackles, the pin she'd lost on the wagon, the gap in the cell door lock old tumblers, she could see them from here. The window above her with its single iron bar that had been mortared into crumbling stone. She had walked into this building before, years ago with her father, to file a land claim. She knew the layout. She knew the back door led out into the alley. She knew the alley ran east to the stables. She started working on the window bar. Gideon and Jasper came in from the north side of Oakhaven at 11, leaving the horses tied in the pine brake above town. On foot, through snow, along the ditch beside the main road where the drift gave them cover. Gideon moved first, Jasper at his left shoulder. They had been watching the town from the ridge for 40 minutes before descending. 2 guards at the Eagle front, 1 outside the back alley. Lantern light in Sterling's office. The rest of the town dark and sleeping. Morrison is on the back, Gideon said. He's the one with the bad knee. He'll be standing close to the wall to cut the wind. Burke is the one who drinks, Jasper said. He's on the front left. I'll go east, come around the saloon side. Jasper touched the inside pocket where the smoke compounds sat. Give me 10 minutes to get in position. Gideon held his wrist briefly. Not long, just for a second. Your shoulder, he said. My shoulder will cooperate until this is over. Jasper met his eyes. 10 minutes, he went. Gideon waited in the dark and listened to the town. A horse shifting in the stable. Wind through the gap between the feed store and the barber shop. Sterling's office window, showing yellow. At 11 minutes, he moved. Morrison was exactly where Gideon predicted, back pressed to the jail wall, collar up, weight on his right leg. Gideon came around the corner of the woodshed at full speed and had Morrison down and unconscious in 3 seconds. Controlled, no gunshot noise. He dragged the man behind the shed and took his keys. Inside the jail, the layout was exactly as Gideon expected. Front desk, 2 cells, back room. He moved through it in darkness by feel and memory. The east side window of the front room shattered in a clean, deliberate way. Glass pushed in, not shattered out, and two of Jasper's smoke vials came through in fast succession. They broke on the floorboards, and the chemical compound caught immediately, burning white and thick and fast. Burke came off the front bench coughing and blind in under 10 seconds. Jasper's boot connected with the front door. At the same moment, Gideon reached the cell block from the back. Maeve heard the glass break and pressed herself to the back wall of the cell. Then the smoke hit the corridor, and she heard Gideon's voice low and direct. Maeve, stand back from the door. The lock gave on the second attempt with Morrison's keys. She stepped out of the cell, and Gideon was there. He looked at her shackles, looked at her face, checked both in one pass. Are you hurt? No, she held up her wrists. Do you have a pick? He produced a flat piece of wire from his vest pocket, with the matter-of-fact calm of a man who had planned for exactly this, and worked the shackle lock in under 2 minutes. She felt the iron fall away and resisted the urge to immediately rub her wrists later. Right now there was no time. The gunfight came from the front of the building. Sterling had heard the glass. He came out of his office with 2 men she didn't recognize, hired hands, brought in for tonight specifically. Jasper met them at the front door. A shot took the lantern off the porch post, plunging that side of the street into dark, and then it was movement and noise and the particular chaos of a close-quarters gunfight in a small town at midnight. Gideon went through the back door with Maeve behind him. The alley was where Sterling had set up the gallows. He was there when they came out, and he had a revolver up and aimed before Gideon cleared the doorframe. Gideon stopped. Sterling moved sideways, creating angle, keeping the revolver level. He was breathing fast, but his hand was steady. Put it down, he said to Gideon, or this ends differently than you planned. Gideon assessed the shot. Too risky. Sterling too far right. He lowered the rifle slowly. Sterling's eyes went to Maeve. He laughed. A short, genuine sound, which made it worse than if it had been theatrical. Still standing, he said. I'll give you that. He looked her over with that same flat assessment he'd used at the jail door. His voice went light with contempt. Though what you're standing on escapes me, you've been nothing but a problem wrapped in extra material, Miss Hollister. I should have handled this 2 years ago. She had stopped moving when he started talking. Now she started again. She crossed the distance between them in 4 fast steps and swung both arms up together. The heavy iron shackle still attached to her left wrist connects across out of Sterling's face with the full weight of her body behind it. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. She drove her shoulder into his chest as the blow landed, and he went back and over the edge of the low gallows platform with a crash that shook the temporary frame. The revolver went into the snow. Maeve landed hard on top of him, knocked the air out of them both, and had the revolver in her hand before either of them fully registered what had happened. She stood up. Sterling lay on his back in the snow at the base of the gallows he'd built to kill her, blood streaming from his cheekbone, staring up at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Genuine surprise. She had never done the thing he expected, not once, and it had finally landed somewhere visible on his face. She kept the revolver on him. Don't move, she said. From the front of the building, she could hear the gunfight winding down. Then Sheriff Silas's voice sharp, cutting through, hands up. Both of you. Sterling's finished. Sterling is done. The sound of men complying, boots in snow, weapons dropping. Jasper appeared at the alley entrance. He took in the scene, Sterling on the ground, Maeve standing over him, Gideon at her shoulder, and he let out a slow breath. Medical smoke works, he said, to no one in particular. Silas came around the corner with his gun on Sterling's 2 hired men, and his face showing 10 years of guilt, finally being put down. He looked at Sterling in the snow. He looked at the gallows. Judge Harlan Bright arrives. February 3rd, he said loudly. Everything this man has done is going on record. Every deed transfer, every bribed jury, every extorted landowner. He looked at Sterling, including this. Sterling said nothing. The surprise had left his face. What replaced it was the flat, contracted look of a man calculating his remaining options and finding the column very short. Dugan came around the stable entrance at a measured walk. He stopped, surveyed the alley. Sterling on the ground, Maeve with the gun, Gideon and Jasper, and Silas all present. He did the arithmetic in his head and stood very still. Maeve lowered the revolver. She reached inside her coat. She had taken the land documents from Sterling's desk, while Gideon worked the shackle lock, the original claim filings, Sterling's private assayer report, the deed transfer papers bearing forged signatures. She'd recognized them immediately. She had helped her father file the originals. She held the documents out to Dugan. "These are the original Hollister land claim filings," she said. "Sterling's fraud is in there, documented, in his own assayer's handwriting." She kept her voice level. "Wells Fargo in San Francisco handles federal land dispute arbitration for the Oregon Territory. You walk these papers to their main office, file them with the arbiter on record, and the Hollister claim is reinstated with full legal standing." A pause. "The silver vein alone is worth north of $40,000 on the conservative end. The finder's fee for delivering evidence of this scale of fraud runs 5% by federal statute." Dugan's eyes went from the papers to her face. "That's 5 times what Sterling promised you," she said, "for delivering paper instead of a person." A long silence. Dugan crossed to her and took the documents. He stood there looking at them for a moment. Then he folded them and put them inside his coat. He looked at Sterling on the ground. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, toward the stable, toward his horse, and he did not look back. Sterling made a sound. "Dugan." But Dugan was already gone, and the alley was quiet, and Sterling's voice fell into the snow with nothing to catch it. Silas stepped forward and got Sterling to his feet with professional efficiency, twisting his arms back. Sterling came up without fight. The calculation was complete, and he knew it. Whatever came next would be in a courtroom, and he would have no bench to sit behind. Jasper appeared at Maeve's left side. She was still watching the spot where Dugan had turned the corner. "You handed him the documents," Jasper said, "before we even got to the alley." "I took them from the desk," she said. "I thought I might need them." A pause. "You planned that in a jail cell." "I had time." Gideon said nothing. He stood on her right and put his coat around her shoulders, because the cold was real, and her coat was insufficient, and some things don't need words. She stood between them in the alley, behind the Oakhaven jail, with Sterling in Silas's grip, and the temporary gallows standing empty behind her, and the snow had stopped falling, and the night was very quiet. The gallows was built to end her story. It was standing at the end of it instead. The cabin looked exactly the same. That was the strange part. Maeve stood in the doorway and looked at the fire ring, still holding ash from 3 nights ago, the wide chair by the hearth, the shelf of books, everything exactly where it had been before Dugan broke the door down and the world fell apart. The door itself had been rehung slightly crooked on the ride back. Gideon had found the hinge pins in the snow and done what he could, and now it sat at a half-degree tilt that let in a thin silver thread of night air at the top corner. Small things, normal things. She was looking at them because her body didn't fully believe she was here yet. Gideon built the fire back up without a word. Jasper sat at the table and let her be, sensing correctly that she needed a minute with the room before she needed anything else. He unwound the dressing on his shoulder by lamplight, with practiced patience, checking the wound with clinical detachment, replacing the packing with fresh cloth from his bag. Maeve moved to the basin, filled it from the kettle on the stove, and washed her face and hands. The water went gray almost immediately from road dust and dried blood that wasn't hers. She washed until the water ran clear, dried her hands on the clean cloth beside the basin. She stood there with her hands pressed flat on the basin edge and looked at the wall in front of her. Sterling was in a cell. The documents were in federal hands. Silas had the sworn affidavits. Dugan was 3 days south, carrying evidence worth a small fortune, with no reason to come back. Judge Bright would arrive in 8 days. It was over. She pressed harder on the basin edge, feeling the wood grain against her palms, solid and real. Braced herself against it. Because the moment you stop moving toward the thing that wants to kill you, all the things you've been holding back while you moved catch up to you at once. the fear she hadn't had time for, the cold, the weight of the last week sitting down on her shoulders all at once. Her eyes filled. She didn't cry. She just stood there with full eyes and pressed palms and let herself feel the full size of what had just happened, and what had very nearly happened, and what had been risked on her behalf. Maeve, Gideon's voice low from across the room. She turned around. He was standing by the hearth. Jasper had closed his medical bag and was watching her too. Both of them still, both of them looking at her with the same thing in their faces. Quiet, open, patient. No urgency, no performance, just presence offered and held. She crossed the room. She didn't think about it. Her feet just went. She reached Gideon, and his arms came around her immediately, large and certain, pulling her in against his chest with the solidity of something that had decided and was done deciding. She felt his heartbeat under her ear, steady and fast, faster than his exterior suggested he had been afraid too. She understood, afraid for her. The thought of that, the fact of it, undid something behind her ribs. Jasper's hand came to rest on her back. Warm through the cloth, she let herself be held, not performing calm, not managing herself, just letting the weight of two people who had ridden into a blizzard for her press in from both sides, warm and real and present. The fire spoke in the grate. The cabin held around them. After a while, she lifted her face. What followed did not have the character of urgency. It had the character of long-held water, finally allowed to move, inevitable, generous, flowing into every place that had been dry. Gideon's mouth found hers with the same steady deliberateness he brought to everything. Jasper's hands moved to her shoulders, then her face, his forehead pressing to her temple for a moment before he turned to her. She let them lead her to the hearth. By the firelight, what happened next was unhurried and complete. Gideon's hands moved over her with reverence, tracing every curve of her with careful, worshipful attention. Every place she had spent years being told was too much, too large, too visible, too present. He found those places, and held them, and looked at her while he held them, not past her, at her. She had been seen in contempt so many times she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen any other way. This was different. This was two men who knew her now, who had watched her survive, plan, grieve, adapt, choose other people over herself, and choose herself when it mattered. They were not seeing a body. They were seeing her, and everything they'd learned in the last 2 weeks was visible in every point of contact. Jasper kissed her cheek, her jaw, the side of her throat. His mouth moved against her skin, and his voice was soft. "You are extraordinary," he said it, the way he said medical facts, plainly certain of the evidence. She reached for him. Her dress came undone by degrees, and with each degree she braced for the old reflex, the shame that always arrived with exposure. It came, smaller this time, thinner, less certain of itself. Gideon's hands moved along her back as the cloth fell away, and he said nothing because he didn't need to. The steadiness of his hands said it for him. She was full-figured and bare in the firelight, and the two men looking at her had no contempt in their eyes, only warmth, only want, only the specific attention of people who found abundance, exactly that abundance. Her hips, her thighs, the soft weight of her belly and breasts. Jasper pressed his lips to her collarbone, and Gideon drew her back against him from behind, and she felt surrounded by warmth on every side. The tears came without her permission, not from sadness, from the overwhelming strangeness of being cherished exactly as she was, of her body being touched, not in spite of what it was, but in full knowledge of it. Every long night of shame, every laugh in the schoolyard, every chair she'd tested before sitting, every dress she'd chosen for concealment, every apology she'd made for existing in a room. Every cruel thing spoken from a crowd, or a pew, or a courthouse, square, all of it was present in this moment, and all of it was being answered. Jasper's hands and Gideon's hands, and the firelight and the warmth were the answer. She moved with them, into them. The pleasure was deep and unhurried, and consumed her entirely, rolling through her body in waves that had no bottom, and at the peak of it, trembling, her eyes bright with tears she wasn't bothering to stop. She breathed out in a voice barely above a whisper, "I can't close my legs." Jasper kissed her forehead, slow and soft and deliberate. Gideon tightened his arms around her from behind, holding her completely, every inch. "Then don't," he said, his voice low with absolute tenderness. "Let us love and cherish every inch of you. Forever." She stopped holding herself at a distance from anything. The three of them came together in the firelight, and what happened between them was not only physical, it was the settling of something long displaced, a homecoming that had nothing to do with geography. Later, she lay between them with the fire burning low and warm, her breathing slow and even, and the tears had dried on her face, and she was not thinking about Sterling or Dugan or the land or anything that waited beyond these walls. She was simply here, simply alive, simply holy, fully herself, and loved exactly as that. She slept deeper than she had in over a year. Judge Harlan Bright arrived on the February 3rd stage, as promised. He was 61, lean, wore his authority with the quiet ease of a man who had earned it slowly and kept it the same way. He had 17 years on the federal circuit and a reputation for running his courtroom the way a surgeon runs a procedure: clean, precise, no room for theater. Sterling's case came before him on February 7th. The hearing room in the Oak Haven Township building was not large, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in weight. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, pressed 3 deep in the doorway. Silas Cobb had given his full affidavit. 3 former jurors from Maeve's original trial had come forward once Sterling's protection evaporated, doing what frightened people do when the thing they feared is finally in chains, talking fast and in detail. The assayer who had surveyed the silver vein testified by written deposition from Salem. Maeve sat at the respondent's table with the land documents in front of her and a board dress that fit her properly, which was a distinction she noticed and appreciated. Gideon was in the second row, Jasper beside him, with his arm in a sling, his shoulder healing clean and on schedule. Sterling sat across the room looking at the table in front of him. When Judge Bright called Maeve to speak to the matter of the original land claim, she stood. She had not prepared remarks. She had something better. She had been living in this truth for a long time, and it came out clean. She addressed the remnants of Sterling's ring directly, the men still clinging to the edges of his enterprise, 2 land agents who had processed the fraudulent transfers, a deputy who had looked the other way, a town council member who had signed documents without reading them. She looked at them steadily. Human dignity, equality, and the right to live belong to everyone, she said. Greed and cruelty are the true deformities in this world. A pause. Never the human body. The room was quiet. She sat down. Judge Bright ruled on the land claim in 40 minutes. The Hollister claim was reinstated in full, the fraudulent transfer declared void, and all mineral rights restored to Maeve Hollister as sole surviving heir. Sterling faced federal charges on 5 counts: land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, corruption of judicial process, extortion, and bribery of public officials. The sentence would come later. Everyone in the room already knew it would be significant. Maeve walked out of the hearing room into February sunlight and stood on the steps and breathed the cold air and let the fact of it settle. She owned the land again, the land her parents had worked, the land under which sat enough silver to build something real. Gideon came to stand beside her. Jasper on the other side, moving carefully with his arm, but upright and present. "How does it feel?" Jasper asked. She thought about it honestly, like putting down something very heavy. She looked at the mountains beyond the town, and like picking something else up. The legal work took 3 more weeks. She had a lawyer from Portland. By the second week, a young woman named Ruth Alderton, who had read about the case in the Oregonian and arrived with a carpet bag full of briefs and a fierce professional manner that Maeve liked immediately. Ruth navigated the probate and mineral rights documentation with the same efficiency Jasper brought to field medicine. And at the end of it all, Maeve's name was on every piece of paper that mattered, in ink that wasn't going anywhere. The silver operation itself was contracted to a Portland mining company with federal oversight written into every clause of the agreement. Maeve negotiated the terms herself, sitting across the table from men twice her age who had expected to do the negotiating. and who learned within the first hour that they were mistaken. She had her father's instinct for numbers and her own hard-won instinct for people, and the contract she signed reflected both. The first payment arrived in March. She sat with the bank draft at the cabin table, with Gideon and Jasper across from her, and read the figure 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. "What will you do with it?" Jasper asked. She had already thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since the night in the jail cell, actually, while she worked the window bar and ran plans through her head. She'd thought about it because it kept her from thinking about everything else. "Part of it goes into a fund," she said. "Legal fees, housing, travel costs. For women in the territory who need to get out of something they can't get out of alone." She smoothed the edge of the bank draft with her thumb. "I am going to call it the Hollister Sanctuary Fund, and I am going to put Ruth Alderton in charge of it because she will be terrifying at it." Jasper was quiet for a moment. "Your parents would have done the same thing." "Yes," she said, "they would have." Gideon reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. Not lingering, just present. She turned the bank draft over and wrote 2 words on the back: Sanctuary Fund. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and looked up at both of them. "Now," she said, "I believe someone mentioned California." Spring came to the Mendocino coast in layers. First, the light changed softer, longer, arriving earlier each morning through the east-facing windows of the new house. Then the grasses came in along the bluffs, green over the brown, inch by inch down toward the cliff edge, where the land met the Pacific. Then the wildflowers scattered through the coastal scrub in yellow and purple and white. Then, finally, the warmth. Real warmth, unhurried and generous, filling the rooms and the porch and the wide yard where Gideon had already put in the fencing for the kitchen garden. Sterling was sentenced in April. Federal prison in Portland. 22 years. Judge Bright had been thorough. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in a letter from Ruth Alderton, who had also enclosed a brief accounting of the Sanctuary Fund's first month of operations. 9 women assisted, 3 legal cases filed, 2 emergency relocations completed, 1 favorable ruling from the county court. Ruth's handwriting was small and precise, and the letter was 4 pages long and entirely businesslike, which was exactly the kind of correspondence Maeve liked best. She read it on the porch with her coffee. The house sat on 12 acres above the bluffs, tucked into a fold of coastal hill that sheltered it from the worst of the sea wind without blocking the view. It was not a grand house. It was well built. There was a difference, and Gideon had been very clear about which one he was interested in. He'd spent 2 months on the framing alone, working with 2 hired hands from the town below, insisting on joints and load points that would last 50 years. Jasper had overseen the medical room on the east side, which doubled as his study, and had filled 3 shelves with books he'd been collecting since the Portland stage carried them south. It was unconventional, what the 3 of them had. They knew that. The town below knew it too. In the way small coastal towns know everything slowly, then all at once, and then with the particular practical acceptance of people who have seen enough of life to pick their arguments carefully. Nobody argued much with Gideon Cross. That helped. Maeve had her own room, her own desk, her own corner of the world. She didn't disappear into either of them. She moved through the house with the ease of someone who had finally learned to take up space as a natural act rather than an apology. She cooked when she wanted to, and asked for help when she didn't, and made decisions about the property with the same direct confidence she'd used in the Portland mining office, and the 2 men in her life treated those decisions with the same seriousness they treated their own. That equality was not accidental. They had talked about it, the 3 of them, in the specific, plain way that people talk about things that matter directly, without performance, adjusting as they went. "I spent 2 years in a field," Jasper had said, "one evening at the cabin table before they'd left Oregon, watching men make decisions about other people's bodies and lives as if they had a natural right to it." He had turned his coffee cup. "I don't have a natural right to anything of yours. What we have, we've chosen every day." Gideon had added nothing, because he'd already expressed the same thing in the chair he'd built, and the bed frame he'd reinforced, and the 100 small daily acts of attention that were, if you looked at them honestly, a continuous argument for her worth. Maeve had understood both. In the late afternoon of a day in May, she stood at the kitchen window, watching Gideon split fence posts in the yard, his shirt rolled to the elbow, axe rising and falling in the even rhythm she associated now with safety rather than labor. Jasper was on the porch with his books. His shoulder healed completely now, his pen moving across a page an article, he'd said, for the Pacific Medical Journal, on field wound management and infection prevention. She finished her coffee. She went to the bedroom and opened the trunk at the foot of the bed. The dress was folded on top, exactly where she'd placed it. She'd had it made in Portland by a dressmaker on 5th Street, who had listened to what Maeve described and made something that was both beautiful and constructed for a real body, not a body adjusted to fit the dress, but a dress built to honor the body wearing it. Deep green cotton, fitted through the bodice, full in the skirt. Simple lines, nothing apologetic about it. She put it on. She stood in front of the small glass above the washstand and looked at herself for a moment, not checking for flaws, not calculating the impression she'd make or the comments she'd receive. Just looking at a woman in a green dress on a May afternoon, standing in her own house, on her own land, with color in her face and light in her eyes, and the Pacific 300 yards away. She went outside. Gideon heard the door and straightened and looked. He set the axe down. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with the quiet attention he gave everything that mattered. "Green suits you," he said. Jasper looked up from the porch. He smiled, the warm, ready smile that had appeared on his face the first night he'd talked her into eating. "You look like the coast," he said. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard, and they came with her, one on each side, out through the gate in the new fencing and down the bluff path toward the cliff edge. The Pacific stretched to the horizon in every direction, blue-green and vast and restless, catching the late afternoon light in 1,000 places at once. The sky above it was going gold and rose and deep orange above the waterline, the sun dropping toward the edge of the world with the unhurried certainty of something that had done this before and would do it again. Maeve stood at the cliff edge between the two men she loved. Gideon's hand found hers. Jasper's hand found the other. She stood there in her green dress, on the Mendocino bluff, with the Pacific enormous before her, and the land at her back, and the warmth of two hands in hers. And she thought about Oakhaven, and the scaffold and the snow. She thought about bare bleeding feet in a blizzard, about a bolt of iron across a man's face, about a jail cell floor, and a plan made in the dark. She thought about her mother's hands in the garden, and her father's voice reading aloud by lamplight, and the land that had known them both for 30 years. She thought about the women Ruth Alderton was helping right now, tonight, in the territory they'd left behind, moving money and legal paper and themselves between the ones who needed help and the help that existed. Doing the work, she thought about the dress she was wearing and the chair built wide enough to hold her, and the voice that had said a body that fights this fiercely to live is a masterpiece on a night when she'd needed it more than medicine. The sun reached the water. Maeve Hollister stood in the last of the light, known completely and loved entirely, radiant in green on the edge of the continent, and she did not look back. And so ends the story of Maeve Hollister, not with a funeral, not with a quiet surrender to the cold, but with a woman standing at the edge of the continent in a green dress, both hands held, the Pacific glittering before her like a promise kept. But before we leave this bluff, let us stay here just a moment longer, because a story like this one carries more than plot. It carries something worth naming. At its heart, this is not a tale about silver or courtrooms or corrupt judges, though all of those things are here. This is a story about what happens when a person who has been told in 1,000 small and large ways, from schoolyards to pew benches to courthouse squares, that they are too much, or not enough, or simply wrong in the shape they inhabit, refuses to believe it. Maeve did not survive that scaffold because luck found her at the right moment. She survived because she had spent 24 years building something inside herself that no rope, no crowd, no blizzard, and no iron shackle could reach. Call it will, call it dignity, call it the stubborn, irreducible knowledge that her life was worth fighting for even when no one else in that square believed so. The lesson this story offers is not a simple one. It does not say that goodness always wins, or that justice is swift, or that the world will eventually recognize your worth on its own. It says something harder and truer than that. It says, the world will often not recognize your worth. You must carry it yourself. First, you must be the one who knows what you are worth, even when you are standing barefoot in a blizzard with a rope mark on your neck and nothing but pine trees and cold air bearing witness. And then, if you are very fortunate, and if you keep walking, you will find people who see what you already know. Not people who rescue you, not people who complete you, but people who build the chair wider. Because they understand that you deserve to sit without bracing for the floor to give way. People who say don't, not harshly, not with impatience, but with the weight of someone who means, your body just fought to live, and I am not going to let you apologize for that. Gideon and Jasper are not heroes in the conventional sense. They do not arrive in time to stop anything. They arrive after. They show up in the aftermath, and they say, here is warmth, here is broth, here is a chair built for you, here is a door I will ride back through, regardless of the cost. The story asks us to consider that this quiet, daily, consistent showing up may be the most profound form of love there is. Not the grand gesture, but the bed frame quietly reinforced. Not the speech, but the hand held out and then stepped back from giving her the choice. And finally, there is Maeve's last act of the story, not standing at the cliff edge, but the one before it, the sanctuary fund. The first thing she does with her inheritance is build a door for others to walk through, because she knows what it costs to be without one, because her parents' land and her own survival have taught her that abundance, real abundance, is not stored, it moves. It reaches. It finds the woman in the territory who needs to get out of something she cannot get out of alone, and it opens. That is the fullest version of this story, not revenge, not triumph over an enemy. A woman who was nearly destroyed choosing, with her first real freedom, to become a shelter for others. Take that with you. Disclaimer, this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or historical incidents is coincidental.